Welcome, everyone. My name is Jack Sider, and for the next hour, I will be talking with Colonel J.C. Vega. He's a cybersecurity professional and a U.S. Army colonel, now retired, with over 3 decades of security leadership experience and 20 years specializing in cybersecurity operations. J.C. has built multiple strategic cyber programs at the Army and national level and at the operational level. J.C., thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
So how did you come about getting to this point in your career?
Well, everyone who's been doing it as long as I have started somewhere else because the discipline hasn't been around that long formally. So every story at this point is unique. And mine is unique in one instance in that I started out tinkering with computers like a lot of people, but I did it for the Army. I was also flying helicopters at the same time. And at some point in my career, the military was looking for people who could understand operations, and that is how we win and how we fight and win wars, but also could understand the technology. So what we did there is they recruited people who were experts in the art of war, and now they said it's easier to teach us the science of technology. And so I was recruited to get into IT. And at that point, I naturally gravitated to security because it was so interesting and so wide open. Literally, the possibilities and the systems were wide open. So I started to dig in and apply my knowledge that I had of operations and apply it to then technology and cybersecurity, now cybersecurity.
Yeah. And so in some of that time, what were some of the things that you have done, collecting information of what kind and where? And
so it's interesting because when you're in security in general, not just cybersecurity, but any kind of security, you look at the world a little bit differently. And one of the things that I learned in the military is this term called OCOCA. And what does that mean? Well, it means observations of fields of fire, cover and concealment, obstacles, both man-made and natural, and key and decisive terrain and avenues of approach. Now, that's a whole laundry list of things. So we use OCOCA. What it does is that gives you a perspective as you're looking to protect or defend something. You're taking into account the environment that you're in. So the O, observation, that's the ability to see over a particular area or target that you're trying to defend or protect against. Then the cover and concealment, that means is how can I, one, not be seen, but two, if you do see me, I can defend myself against you. You also have the idea of obstacles, both man-made and natural, and that's anything you can put in the way of the threat that will stop, impede, slow you down, or divert the movement. And why is a diversion important? Because a diversion allows you to engage the threat where you are the strongest. In other words, under your terms. That gets into key and decisive terrain. You want to set the conditions where any threat is going to come at you at the place that you're most, that's most defensible. And then you shore up your weak areas, but you don't want to fight on their terms. You want to fight on your terms. And that gets into the avenues of approach. And that means the route that they're going to take. So think of it from a cyber perspective. When someone uses, let's just say they're doing a reconnaissance of you, what is it that you want them to see? What is it they're trying to see? And as they start to footprint your environment, they're starting to gather information. Now they're trying to find some place to gain entry. What you're trying to do is you're trying to set those conditions. So that's at an operational level to a cybersecurity level. So now raise that up to nation state. We do the same thing. When I say the United States and other foreign countries, we try to set the conditions to when we see a threat or an adversary or near peer positioning to gain a strategic advantage over somebody or an organization or a nation or a region, you try to counter that. And you see the expansion of China and the South Pacific. You also see others influencing other regions. In this case here, you have US bases positioned forward, so we can defend forward. Why is this? This is so that you can have that observation, so you can find that decisive terrain where you could impact something, and you can also direct how something is going to happen or not happen. Because if you can predict it and you can see how the threat might take advantage of that, you can start to have counteractions and be prepared for that. And so a lot of that, what you see it from, again, a cybersecurity and at a tactical level to a nation state strategy, is you try to see how is it best for you to defend against the threats that are out there and be able to immerse yourself in the environment so that when something does change, when the balance of power starts to get questioned and people start to position, or organizations start to position to fill that gap, you're able to recognize it because you're a part of it. And so again, that's a long story there, but
yeah, I mean, you talk about defending the threats and stuff. When it comes to foreign nations, it's very difficult for me to figure out, what is a threat to us versus a threat to them might be different. And it's maybe a cultural difference as well. It's just tough for me to figure out what's right or wrong and for other nations to do or not do. What are some of the considerations to determine like what's right or wrong when dealing with international diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a great question, because oftentimes when we look at a problem or we look at a challenge, we look at it from our perspective because our perspective is correct. And that is a true statement. Your perspective is correct to you, but it doesn't mean it's correct to me. And so culture is relative. It's relative to our own standards. It's relative to our own belief of what is right and wrong and what is strange, what is normal. And one thing that you have to consider when you're dealing with nation states and even within different regions is the cultural practices, not just at the surface, but sometimes at the root level, where different groups who they may appear to be cordial to one another, but there's history there that we have to understand sometimes what is driving that and what will be a trigger that's going to set something off. So when we talk about culture here in the United States, I've lived all over the country and a few places in the world, and I realize that culture is relative to where you're at and people who are from that area, and you can quickly spot the transplant because they don't behave the same way as someone who's local, who's a native there. And again, it doesn't have to be native like from a state or a particular, the United States. It could be very regional, down to cities, towns, coastal communities, desert communities. And when you get into in a worldly state, you have to take into account what they believe is right and what they believe is right and wrong and where that perspective comes from. And some things that we might find strange are actually quite normal to them, and vice versa. Some of the things that we do are very strange to foreigners, but it's quite normal to us. So you have to take that cultural is relative to your perspective.
Yeah. Now, the U.S. as well, but some countries in the Middle East have developed some impressive offensive cyber capabilities, and other countries have simply outsourced some of their cyber capabilities. And they have actually expressed, ability to carry out some of these cyber attacks as well. What are some considerations when it comes to maybe creating some sort of international law or guideline on how nations should conduct themselves in cyberspace?
That is a tough question because it goes back to that original statement of what is considered acceptable. We're seeing a relative escalation in hostilities in the Middle East right now. And what we consider from a Western perspective of being over the top, perhaps, locally, they don't necessarily see it the same way, thus they're reacting that way. And so I don't want to get into the specific details about that, but the idea of what is acceptable and what is not is very difficult for someone from the outside to pass judgment on that. But that being said, we do live in a society of laws or rules or traditions. And they can be state laws, they can be treaties, they can be traditions, but they also have, break it down to civil law, common law, customary law, religious laws, mixed laws. All of these different things come into account on what is and what isn't acceptable. So to have a coalition of the willing, as we use in different military operations, you see countries that tend to have a similar belief system or similar values that often work together. So think of the Five Eyes, which is Canada, the United States, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. But even they are challenged where they don't completely agree on everything. And then you have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And you have the UN. And the idea is to come with some general understanding at a very fundamental level on what is acceptable from one region to the other, but that can be a common law or term that is applicable to everyone. And that is a tough sell. It's a tough sell, especially in cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is almost an equalizer. You don't have to be one of the most powerful countries in the world to develop cyber capability. Individuals can come up with cyber capabilities, can develop cyber capabilities. They have the skills. And we say, if you have the will, the time, and the resources, everybody can be touched. And so the idea of coming up with a single structure that is acceptable to everyone under most conditions, like the Talon Manual tries to propose, that's a challenge. And because it's so hard, publications like the Talon Manual are sometimes looked at as hope, but not reality. But that's not to say we shouldn't strive for that.
Yeah, I just wonder if who would even be in the position to make such rules, if they said these are, like, let's say foreign nations can't attack citizens of another country or businesses of another country. It can only just be from government to government kind of attacks. And maybe if there's a rule like that, I don't even know who would be in the position to make such a rule that would, friendly nations might like that rule, but unfriendly ones won't, respect it. And it's interesting.
No, and there's extreme rules with that. Again, serving in the armed forces for almost 30 years, there's certain protections that we receive from the Geneva Convention. But those protections only stand if we follow the rules ourselves. So not everyone and not everything is protected by the Geneva Convention. In other words, you can commit a war crime if you don't follow the rules. But again, not everyone. Those are for armed combatants. And that's an agreement between nations. And there's a whole lot of gray in there for the non-nation states and those who don't agree to those rules. But just because they don't agree to them, that does not mean that we won't. In essence, we will win morally if that's the case, but we can't compromise on our own morality on that.
Now, the U.S. has multiple strategic investments within regions in the Middle East. Like if you just look at where the U.S. military bases are, it's pretty clear that there's interest in those areas. But I wonder what other nations have invested interest as well, or what partner nations, and how that kind of maybe shapes or influences the Middle East, or maybe there's some considerations there that we haven't thought about and what's going on there.
And that's a great point. Being that we're interconnected, we talk about this with cyber and technology and the information age, but even before that, we were interconnected and we had dependencies on one another. And the idea of having strategic alliances goes way back. I mean, you can look at World War II and even beyond that. And you may not agree on everything, but you do have some things that you do agree on that make it palatable to team up with somebody. Because when it comes to conflict, you want more friends than enemies, and you want powerful friends. And so the idea of having strategic alliances is something that now potentially we may see in cybersecurity as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Is if the U.S. is assisting, by defending certain ports or things like that, physical spaces within the Middle East. I also wonder if they're defending in any sort of cyberspace capability as well.
And I can't comment to that because I don't know what we're doing when it comes to operations. And so let me make that disclaimer right now. If I imply that I know what the United States is doing, that is not the case here. I'm retired. I'm no longer a part of that whatsoever. But the idea makes sense. And that is to say, if you have an ally that is close to you, not just in agreement of their policies or whatever common ground you can find, having that ally on your soil can have its advantages as well. Because if there's a threat to that base or that ship or that infrastructure that can harm or potentially have an impact on the interest of the nation state that is the guest in the host country, you're now potentially conducting an operation against a much larger entity than just the host nation. So if you have a US base, for instance, in Kuwait, and you decide to, or someone decides to conduct hostile operations against Kuwait, the US bases are there still. And so the US may exert its right to defend itself. And part of that may be defending the infrastructure around it, which would be a foreign nation.
Yeah, and I wonder as nations partner and create bases in other nations in the Middle East, I wonder how that partnership can sometimes influence the region that they're involved with.
And that's an important thing to look at. But let's take a step back. It's not just nation states. And here, from a Western perspective, we think of the separation of the private sector and government that's very clear, almost as clear as church and state here. But when you look at other areas, there isn't that separation. Business and the nation state are intertwined. Criminal activity and the nation state is allegedly intertwined. So when you see behavior of, let's say, ports being owned by certain countries, that is strategic projection. And that means you're projecting your power, your influence in that region by controlling the economy, the economic impact. And remember, when we talked before, I talked about DIME. What are the sources of power? Well, there's diplomatic, information, military, and economic things we can do to exert our will in certain areas.
Yes. Now, information is the fifth domain of warfare, and it appears that there's a fierce arms race underway. Everyone's trying to find new ways of exploiting other tools and 0 days and all this kind of stuff. Some countries are trying to preserve their leg up in this space, while other countries are trying to establish their own abilities to just conduct operations in this area. This all sprang up in our lifetime, though, and so it feels new. It feels like this is a new kind of arms race. Is it new, though?
Getting a little philosophical here, we have Thomas Kuhn's and his cycle of science, and there's a period where none of the rules make sense because there's a new science that is emerging. And as it's emerging, we're making the rules up as we go along. What we used to understand as truth, that you can develop policy around something and you could expect the outcome to come out, to result in however you influence that. That is not the case right now. Because for instance, cybersecurity, it doesn't necessarily take a national power or national resources to have an impact. Look at the ransomware attacks that we recently had and still continue to have around the globe. Just this morning, we read about our food supply chain being interrupted. And a few weeks ago, it was our fuel supply chain being interrupted. And allegedly, these aren't nation state. These are common criminals. But a common criminal can now impact a nation or region. That's new. That's new. How do you harness that? How do you put that in check? Who do you put in check? Especially if the local authorities aren't concerned because it's not happening to them. This is happening abroad. So who do we target? As a nation state, we target governments. We target other nations. We don't target necessarily common criminals, at least not the Department of Defense. There's other aspects of the government that can do that, the FBI, the Secret Service, and other arms. Add any three-letter agency you want in there. But from an armed forces perspective, we're not designed to respond to common criminals.
No, it gets a little tricky there because, yeah, I understand that, the common criminal is kind of off the, not their jurisdiction, basically. But in some nations, they're not waging their attacks from the government entity per se. It's almost like a proxy war where they're using another group to empower and enable you guys take out, do these cyber attacks on our behalf, but we're going to deny that it was from us completely. And so you get this weird kind of, well, no, we didn't do it. It was this other group. And, you don't go after cyber criminals. So good luck. Do you ever have that into that?
Attribution is challenging in this space. When you want to influence someone's behavior, the reinforcement has to be near immediate so that they recognize that the punishment that is being imposed on you has to do with your behavior that we did or didn't want you to do. Like training our pet, we tell them to sit, we give them a treat, and they associate the treat with the sit. So every time you tell them to sit, and then once they're ready, they're going to be falling to the ground to get that treat. It works on people too. And the idea of having that reinforcement. The challenge we have with attribution in cybersecurity is that it's not immediate. And we can put some roadblocks. We talked about the observation earlier in the part of the conversation is I can let you see what you want, what I want you to see, not necessarily the truth. And it takes a lot of skill and a lot of time. But sometimes when you do figure it out, it doesn't matter anymore. The money's gone. The impact that somebody had, that person or team or group has already had their will and is off to something else. So that the idea of being able to respond or strike back or do something like that is a challenge in our space. And then what if you get it wrong? What if you strike the wrong people, the wrong group? And what if it's disproportionate? Now we start getting into some other challenges. Now, again, we're a nation of laws. We have our culture. And we say we'll win honorably. But that's not everybody, and that's not every group that's out there performing these operations. So the idea of putting a self-constraint based on our culture, based on our belief system and our laws is not necessarily working in our favor. And I'm not advocating that we should change that because we have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror in the morning.
You know, whenever there is a foreign adversary that attacks us, our media likes to go straight to the term, this is an act of cyber war. I feel like they're always jumping too soon to say something like that because, in my opinion, there's no deaths typically with a cyber attack. And so it's difficult to equate electronic, stealing stuff electronically versus killing people. But I wonder do you have a definition of what a cyber war is, or if you were to see it, how would you know that's one?
So there's a standard definition that I can't quote off the top of my head now on what is and what isn't warfare, and then what would apply to cyber. But even if we had that right in front of us right now, each instance would have to be looked at, and there's going to be a lot of smart people who are going to weigh in on what just occurred. Because in this instance here, when we talk about warfare, is it warfare if a common criminal does something that if a nation state did it, it would be considered an act of war. But if a common criminal does it, that's not necessarily the same result, the same outcome. So if you look at when the rules of war apply, there's a lot of factors that go into that, or acts of war. It doesn't necessarily mean just because you saw an attack and if it automatically is an act of war. And then when you hear the media saying we should respond in kind, well, that's challenging. Again, we already talked about attribution. We talked about that it may or may not be a nation state. It may be just common criminals. Who are you going to attack? Because now if the United States does respond, that can be an act of war because you are attacking potentially civilians, not the government. So now you have the law enforcement action also that you can take into account. But again, you're talking about very specific rules and laws that have to be followed, because if you don't follow this structure, it could be the Wild West out there. And then anybody can do anything because those who have the most power are acting freely and without responsibility. Then how are we going to hold anyone else accountable for their behavior or their action? And so part of that is helping those countries that don't have the technology, don't have the skill set, helping them to be able to protect their own infrastructure and be able to prosecute and fine those perpetrators that are operating within their jurisdiction. And that's not uncommon either.
Yeah, you talk about consequences, and there's many nations in the Middle East that have been victims of cyber attacks, but there seems to be, I mean, from my point of view, a lack of consequences. Like, for instance, when the UAE gets attacked through a cyber attack, they don't sanction people if they know, even if they know who it is or not. There just doesn't seem to be anything there. And if they do sanction, they just don't seem to matter or hold up in any way. So I'm curious to know what you would think. How should countries respond to cyber attacks, within their neighboring nations and stuff in the Middle East?
Again, that's another great question. And I'll fall back to the perspective that we take on this here. So from a Western perspective, our courts are open. We see the media, we see the spectacle, and everything is wide open for everyone to see. And even then, even when you try to hide something, it still comes out. So, but doesn't mean that that's the same in other areas or other countries. So what you see may not necessarily be the whole truth. It's just what you're permitted to see. Now, that being said, cyber crosses geographic borders. So there has to be I would propose that there would have to be some type of consortium, some type of agreement that's regional, that if something happens within this area, knowing that this type of threat doesn't see borders as an obstacle, so perhaps the response shouldn't also be limited by borders. And what we would call that here is some type of joint task force with a neighboring country, where we agree under these certain conditions, these circumstances, that we're going to work together to provide some stability or some response for a regional threat, not just a nation state threat to someone within the confines of a border, because that can be limiting. A natural disaster doesn't have borders, so the response is usually a combined effort from all the resources that are available in the region that can help. Perhaps cyber can learn from those different models. You have the Doctors Without Borders, you have WHO, however you feel about that. But the idea is that you have these organizations that are looking to protect and provide some support to areas and countries that otherwise wouldn't be able to do it on their own.
Something I was thinking about, I'm not sure if you would know or not, but when the U.S. is attacked by foreign hackers, there's often indictments. If there's enough information, there's indictments. And even if it's a foreign nation that attacks the U.S., those hackers who were involved get indicted. And, but I always wonder that, why would they, if another country attacks us, why would they indict the hackers and not the officers or the leaders or even the president and say, well, you did an attack on us, so we're going to indict your president, right? Do you have any opinion on who should be held responsible for a cyber attack?
So I am not a lawyer, and my lawyer friends will tell me at this point is you need to stick to what you know. Mm-hmm. So I will tell you that I don't know, but that doesn't mean I can't have an opinion. Mm-hmm. And so here's my opinion on that. If it's not looked at an act of war, if it's looked as a criminal activity by somebody, then through our justice system, we'll go after the individual, the perpetrators. And that's why you see the Department of Justice going after these people, not the Department of Defense. And they're being indicted by those laws, not the laws of war. And so you can pick the tool set that you have to be able to reach out and impact these individuals. And if you ask me, if I knew somebody was going to go after me directly, it might impact my behavior at the end of the day. So I can't hide behind my boss told me to do that when someone is going after me directly. And I'm not afforded the protections, especially if I leave that country. And although COVID has kept us from traveling, many of these people have the ability to travel. And when they do, you can bet that there are people watching their movements where they're going.
Now, the Middle East is rich in oil, and that means traditionally they've created a lot of petroleum engineers at their universities and people who are involved with, oil production and this kind of thing. But I wonder if there should be, in your opinion, maybe like a shift to more IT or security engineers. And if so, how could that become more popular?
So we all have that challenge right now. That is not just a problem in the Middle East. That's a problem globally, that we don't have enough defenders, enough people who are qualified to do the job. So there's a couple of parts of that. One, we need the education system to create these individuals, but we also have to make the technology easier to use. And that's a whole nother discussion that we're not on pace to ever fill that gap. But that being said, let's focus on the Middle East. You have a different culture there. Not everyone can go to school. Not everyone can get an education. Not everyone can perform certain jobs. So you're limited on what you can do just based on whether you're a man or a woman. And so there's challenges there that are tough to overcome when we already don't have enough people in the field. And yet, if you narrow that pipeline down to only a select few, then you're really eliminating your ability to create your own workforce organically. So again, taking that culture into consideration, is that going to happen for the sake of cybersecurity? I don't know the answer to that, but that is something that region has to wrestle with. So how they're going to do it, we know the challenge. We know it's not getting any better. Are they going to outsource that talent? Are they going to create it organically? Are they going to, I know they're bringing the education there, or the educators. I have colleagues who go and teach in the Middle East, but is it going to be enough? Well, here in the United States, where everything is wide open for everybody, we still don't have enough, and we're not on a pace to bridge that gap. So they have some real challenges there.
Yeah, I think my theory on that is to get more IT and security people. I really think it needs to start from the top, and it's just like this in any organization. To improve the cybersecurity of your company, the CEO of the company really needs to be preaching it all the way down, right? You can't go upwards to make security go higher. It needs to start from the top and go down. And I think the same thing could work with nations, right? If the president, if the leader of the country is saying, we're going to make this a prime directive from now on, we're going to secure our government, we're going to secure our companies, we're going to secure this, then that's going to have this trickle down effect that now many, many people all over are going to be like, well, we got to get involved with this too. And I have a feeling that in the last 10 years or so, there has been this shift of, we don't need to really worry about that so much, to, okay, we just got hit and it hurt us a lot. And so now let's redefine this. Let's create a search, right? Where countries didn't have certs before in the Middle East, but now they're starting to make them, and let's have a more focus here. And I think, when it starts from the top down, it really makes that bigger impact.
You're absolutely right. That's leadership 101. You have to be the exemplar to your team. You can't have a double standard, and cybersecurity is definitely up there. And this might actually be, I never thought about it this way, but it might be an advantage to those countries. compared to the United States is because their leaders can dictate more so than here in the United States. We can't agree from a government perspective on whether, which way to go, left or right or up or down. And even if the government decides to do something, that doesn't trickle down to the private sector or education system, because they're separate and they operate independently. They get guidance, but no one at the federal level is telling the states what they have to do. That's a state level decision. But in these other countries, that's a different challenge. They do have more control, more centralization of power. So if they wanted to do it, they're probably in a better position to have that prime directive. But it's going to come at a cost because they have other cultural challenges that they would have to overcome. And that's not necessarily in agreement with the norms in that region. So it's going to be a challenge no matter what.
Now, I don't know enough about the region to really say much about it in this way, but I feel like there isn't enough focus on defending their own networks in some areas, right? And I'm wondering if that's even an option today, to ignore cybersecurity and just feel like, you don't see anything, nothing's wrong, but there's really people inside your network reading all your things. What kind of focus should Middle Eastern countries put on IT infrastructure and securing their networks?
I can't speak to any one country or any one's critical infrastructure in the Middle East. But knowing some of the people who work in that region, I would say that Saudi Aramco is probably a good example for others to follow. And they learned that the hard way. They were attacked and they invested tremendously to not just get back online, but to also provide a resilient operation after that. And they had to make some cultural shifts to allow that to happen by allowing women leaders in certain positions to take charge and direct what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, because they did have the expertise necessary to accomplish the task at hand. But so there's hope. There's hope as far as that's concerned. And one thing that region does have is, with the oil, it has the resources that go with it. So they do have the ability to contract out some of their security that they otherwise, that some other regions don't. And the question is, what is going to be their focus? Is it their critical infrastructure? Is it their government? Is it all in the same? That's something that each area there, each region, because even within the Middle East, we look at it as one giant region. It's not. It's several small regions as well. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution there. You have to look at each country's interest at that particular moment on what is best for the sake of the leadership, their people, and their long view. And that's who they're going to decide who they're going to partner with, who they're going to ally with, and who they're going to align with. And that's going to be a question, or the challenges that each country is going to have to face individually. And there's no simple answer there, because if you align with, not say the wrong people, but the enemy of your enemy type thing, you can potentially create more challenges by your solution that you choose.
Well, you know what? This hour flew by. I've been really fascinated with what you had to say, and I could listen to you talk for a few hours more. But yeah, thanks for your time today. This has been great.
I appreciate it.